until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus did not come to do away with the law. He did not come to this earth to abolish the Ten Commandments. Rather, he is teaching the exact same sort of thing that the psalmist is teaching, isn't he? He's saying that this law is given to us by a graceful God in freedom. It is something that we should delight in. It is something that if we obey it, we will be great in the kingdom of heaven. We will be blessed by God. And so the Ten Commandments have a relevance in this age. They help us to live as God created us to live. There was once a preacher named John Calvin, and these are some of the things that he said about the law. These are some of the things that he said about the Ten Commandments. Here is the best instrument for Christians to learn more thoroughly each day the nature of the Lord's will to which they aspire, to confirm them in the understanding of it. For no man has attained to such wisdom as to be unable, by the daily instruction of the law, to make fresh progress towards a pure knowledge of the divine will. What Calvin is saying is this: Christians should aspire, Christians should crave, Christians should desire to do the things that God has called us to do. We should desire to obey His commandments. It's something that is natural. It's something that is part of being a Christian. And in order to fulfill this desire in your life, you need to study the law. You need to look at it. You need to study it. You need to make sure that it becomes a part of you. And then Calvin says that there is no one in this entire world that can't benefit by studying the law every day. Think about the really great preacher, the guy on TV that everybody looks up to. Can he benefit from studying the law? Yes. There are still more things that he can learn. Think about the seminary professor that trains other pastors. Can he benefit by studying the law? Absolutely. Think about the really, really great people in the Christian faith like the Apostle Paul. Could he benefit by studying the law? Do you think that he ever got to some point in his life where he knew everything or that there is to know about the law? No. Even he could benefit by studying the law every day. And so every single person here needs to study the law. We need to understand it, because even if you've learned a lot about it in the past, there is still more to learn. The Holy Spirit when you study the law, the Holy Spirit is going to teach you more about God and more about yourself. Amen. When you're looking at that commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, then it should remind you that you have a perfectly faithful God. You have a God that is always going to be standing there with you. He is going to be faithful to you. Because the Ten Commandments teach us something about God whenever we look at one of them. And they also teach us a lot about ourselves. They teach us where our weaknesses are. They teach us where our shortcomings are. They show us these places where we need to change. And when we start to see these things, and it makes us depend on God more and more every single day. And Calvin then goes on to say that the law helps to keep us out of trouble. By frequent meditation on the law, we are aroused to obedience, strengthened in it, and drawn back from the slippery path of transgression. If you are a believer in this room today, you have been set free from the slavery of sin. Given that you've been set free, why would you want to go back into captivity? If you had the bonds taken off of your hands and given freedom, why would you want to ever be in bondage again? Well, as a Christian, you are better able than other people to know that sin doesn't bring real happiness. Submit yourself to God. Submit yourself in obedience to His law, because it's in obedience to the law that you're going to find real happiness, real joy. So commit yourself to studying. Now let's talk about the separation of law and the gospel. There are a lot of people in history that would not agree with all this stuff that I've just said. This is a problem that has been coming up for the last 2,000 years. There are a lot of people who say that we are not required to follow the Ten Commandments. They would say that because the gospel has come, the Ten Commandments are no longer very relevant to our lives. We can go back and look at them because they might be a fairly good guide for wise living, but there is nothing that is really binding upon us. There's nothing that says that we must do these things. That's what people have said. A lot of people have said this for the last couple of thousand years. What do you think? Before you answer that question, let's look at some verses that they would use to support that argument. These people have come to this conclusion by looking at some verses of the Bible that seem to teach what I've just said. We are not under the law, but under grace. Romans chapter 6, verse 4. The Christian is no longer under the supervision of the law, Galatians 3. If you're led by the Spirit, you are not under the law, Galatians 5. The law is fading away, 2 Corinthians 3:11. Whereas the gospel is something that continues on. What do you think? Those are verses that seem to teach that we are not under the law. It seems to teach that the law is not binding on us in any way. And so a lot of people have said that. Well, I'm going to look at a couple of these verses, and I'm going to look at them in some detail, and I'm going to try to prove to you that you are required to obey the law as a Christian if these people are wrong. And here's a couple of the ground rules that we're going to have. As we look at these verses, we're going to try to do a couple of things. We're going to try to avoid thinking that there are blatant contradictions in the Bible. We're not going to jump to the conclusion and say that there are blatant contradictions in the Bible. Here's what I mean by contradiction. What color is this Bible?
Black.
It is black. If I said this Bible is red, that would contradict with reality. This Bible is black. And so a contradiction is where there are two statements that are being made that cannot both be true. The Bible cannot both be black and red at the same time and in the same way. This is a black Bible. Okay? That's a contradiction. And we're not going to immediately assume the Bible has a bunch of them. We're going to give the Bible a chance to speak before we come to that sort of a conclusion. The second thing that we're going to try to do is to look at these verses in context. If you were to take a few verses from the Bible, a paragraph or two from the Bible, and you were to write out each of the verses individually on little pieces of paper, and you were to put them into a bag, and you were to shake up that bag, and you were to take them out and read them, it probably wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. And oftentimes, if you take one verse out of its context, when you take it out of the place where it sits naturally, then it becomes a lot harder to understand. And so we're going to try to look at these verses in relationship to the words that are spoken around them, the words that are spoken before and after them. So let's look at Romans chapter 6, verse 14. This is a verse that people use to say we are not required to obey the Ten Commandments. Romans 6:14. You are not under the law, but under grace. Now, if all you're doing is looking at that one little tiny verse, it is possible for you to misunderstand it. If that's the only thing you have, and you're trying to understand it apart from everything that's been said around it, it is possible for you to understand it. Now let's look at it in context. Let's back up a little bit to verse 12. So this is Romans beginning in verse 12 of chapter 6. Let not sin, therefore, reign in your mortal body to make you obey its passions. Do not present your members to sin as instruments for unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments for righteousness. For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under the law, but under grace. Now, if you're paying attention, if you're reading this in context, you should come to a conclusion immediately. Whatever Paul means by you're not under the law but under grace, it cannot mean that we are free to disobey the law. Why is that? Because of the verses that came right before. How are you going to